this morning, James is going to do our Bible reading. If you want to come join me up here, if you guys would please stand, if you're able, as we read the Word this morning. We are in the book of Ruth, chapter number 1. I told him he only had 11 verses, and then I sent it to him. It's like the longest 11 verses in the Bible, so it's going to do good. But James, if you would.
When Naomi heard in Moab that the Lord had come to the aid of his people by providing food for them, she and her daughters-in-law prepared to return home from there. With her 2 daughters-in-law, she left the place where she had been living and set out on the road that would take them back to the land of Judah. Then Naomi said to her 2 daughters-in-law, "Go back, each of you, to your mother's home. May the Lord show you kindness, as you have shown kindness to your dead husbands and to me. May the Lord grant that each of you will find rest in the home of another husband." Then she kissed them goodbye, and they wept aloud, and said to her, "We will go back with you to your people." But Naomi said, "Return home, my daughters. Why would you come with me? Am I going to have any more sons who could become your husbands? Return home, my daughters. I am too old to have another husband. Even if I thought there was still hope for me, even if I had a husband tonight and then gave birth to sons, would you wait until they grew up? Would you remain unmarried for them? No, my daughters, it is more bitter for me than for you, because the Lord's hand has turned against me." As this they wept aloud again. Then Orpah kissed her mother-in-law goodbye, but Ruth clung to her. "Look," said Naomi, "your sister-in-law is going back to her people and her gods. Go back with her." But Ruth replied, "Don't urge me to leave you or to turn back from you. Where you go, I will go, and where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord deal with me, but ever so severely, if even death separates you and me. When you die, I will die, and there I will be buried."
Yeah. Amen. You can hang this right there on the... You guys can be seated. I'm excited to celebrate our third birthday with everybody this morning. And if y'all don't eat that red velvet cake, it gets to be my lunch for the week, so. I want to start this morning by telling you the story of a woman named Joanne. Joanne was born in 1965, and she was married in the early 90s, and in the mid-90s, I think between 1993 and 95, she went through a pretty nasty divorce, and she ended up divorced in 1995 and had moved to a new country to get away from her ex-husband. She was 28 years old, and her marriage had separated after just 13 months. And then they had a kind of a prolonged divorce that involved a restraining order, and she moved to a new city where she didn't know anybody, and she was a single mother living on welfare, making, I think, $65 a week, which, if y'all are old enough to remember, in 1995 wasn't too bad compared to now. You could fill up your gas and buy groceries and do a few things with $65. But she often would skip meals so that her daughter could eat. And she worked as a researcher and a secretary, and she was a writer. And she had been working on a novel and had just gotten a couple of chapters done. And when she went through this divorce, she would walk her baby around in the stroller until the baby fell asleep. And then she would make her way into cafes and sit down and write on scraps of paper. And her divorce was finalized, and she finished her first book in June of 1995. And she submitted this book to all the major publishers, and all the major publishers rejected her book. And 2 years later, a small publisher said, hey, we'll take on your project, we'll publish your book. And they printed a whopping 5,650 copies, which, if you don't know, is not a lot of copies of a book. And she made $4,200 in royalties. If you can imagine working for 3 or 4 years on something, and then you get your big break and you sell it and you make $4,000 for years of work. A year later, that publisher was auctioning off some of their rights to some of their books. And the first book that she had written was purchased by the Scholastic Corporation. I don't know if they still do it or not, but if you're my age, we had book fairs. You know, they still do that? And they were put on by the Scholastic Corporation. And so they would give you this, this catalog you would take home, and you could check which one you wanted, turn them in, and then they would mail you the books later. And the Scholastic Corporation, they bought the rights to her first book, and they paid her $105,000. That was in October of 1998. 4 months later, that book was a New York Times bestseller. And Joanne, her friends called her Jo, but you probably know her by her pen name of J.K. Rowling, wrote 3 more books over the next 3 years, each one of them selling millions of copies. And in 1999, she sold the rights to the first book to, I think, Warner Brothers. And the Harry Potter franchise was born. And she has since then twice been named to the world's billionaires list. She was named to the billionaires list in 2005, and then she divested some stuff, and then again just a year ago she made it back onto the billionaires list. And the Harry Potter franchise turned into the multimedia empire that we see it today, with 8 books in the original series, all the movies that go along with it, and all that. It's so why are we talking about J.K. Rowling? Well, there's a point to that, and what I want you to catch is that at one point in 1993, Joanne, J.K. Rowling, she looked like someone the world would overlook. She was broke, she was alone, she was rejected, living outside of normal society. If you were alive in the 90s and the 80s, being divorced was kind of a stigma that you carried back then. And if you looked at her story in that moment, when she was broke, when she was divorced, when she was living on welfare, you might have concluded that there's no coming back from a situation like that. How many people just accept their lot in life when things go wrong? But what looked insignificant, what looked like an ending, was actually the beginning of something much bigger. And that's exactly what we're going to see this morning in the story of Ruth. The title of the message this morning is The People God Uses. The people God uses. Well, I've got a lot of notes, so I'm just going to jump into the first point this morning, that Ruth was faithful. Ruth was faithful. If you'll remember, a couple of weeks ago, we talked about Balaam. And as a result of that story, when we talked about Balaam, the Ammonites and the Moabites were cursed. It's okay, you're not cursed. You're good to go. But let me read to you from Deuteronomy. This is the curse. It says, "No Ammonite or Moabite or any of their descendants may enter the assembly of the Lord, not even in the 10th generation." So if a generation lasts roughly 20 to 30 years, we're talking about hundreds of years here, okay? Like they're not allowed to be part of the Jewish culture. And by the time we get to the book of Ruth, the Israelites had to flee Israel due to a famine. And they found themselves living in Moab. And as the Israelites were prone to do, they did whatever they wanted, and they started taking Moabite wives. And that's where Naomi and Ruth enter the story. You see, Naomi had been married to a man named Elimelech. There's a quiz on the names later, so take notes. And don't worry, I called Orpah Oprah for like 3 days this week. I literally noticed this morning and I had to change my notes back in the office. I was like, how many times did I type this into my notes? But Elimelech and Naomi had 2 sons, and their 2 sons married 2 women named Ruth and Orpah. And kind of in a like Job-esque manner, the whole family, all the men die. So Elimelech dies and his 2 sons die. And so all 3 of these women, these Moabite women who had married into a Jewish family, all 3 of these Moabite women are now widowed. And you see Naomi telling Orpah and Ruth, like, hey, I don't have any more sons for you to marry. There's no one left, so you guys are free to go. And the famine ends, and Naomi decides to return to Israel because now there's some provision. Like they can go back to the tribe of Judah. That was Elimelech's tribe. So they could go back and kind of join back with the family. And so Naomi decides to move back home after everything has fallen apart and there's nothing really waiting on her. She wasn't allowed legally to own the land. And so she was going back to Israel, but she had no way to earn money, no fortune, nothing. She was completely destitute. And Naomi tells her daughters-in-law, and she says, I'm too old. Even if I could have a son right now, it would take years for them to be old enough to marry. And like, there's no way for me to legitimize you. So you guys need to like go do your own thing. Like, you know, you're widowed, you're free to go. And Orpah just like, sweet, I'm out of here. She bounces, she's out. And Ruth stays, we read it, but let me read it to you again in verse 16 of chapter 1. She says, don't urge me to leave you or to turn back from you. Where you go, I will go, and where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God. You see, somewhere along the way, this pagan Moabite woman had come to know the Lord. You see, faith doesn't always look like stepping into something better. Sometimes it looks like holding on when nothing else makes sense. And Naomi was a bitter woman. We know that because she says so. In a lot of ways, she was right to be bitter. Like she had lost everything. And when she's greeted, they say, hey, there's Naomi. And she says, no. Don't call me Naomi, call me Mara. In Hebrew, this matters because the name Naomi means pleasant. The name Mara means bitter. And she says, don't call me pleasant, call me bitter. You ever have one of them days where you're like, today is not the day? I don't know if you've gone so far as to change your name to just like, my name is bitter. But she's telling the people she encounters, I'm not a pleasant person anymore. I've been through some stuff and it's made me bitter. I'm bitter because of the things that have happened to me. And in that situation, Ruth had every right to leave her. So I don't want to be around this bitter old woman anymore. I'm going to go start a new life. We don't know exactly how old they are, but Ruth is evidently a much younger woman, and she probably had lots of life ahead of her. The context in there when she meets her future husband was that she didn't look atrocious. She probably looked pretty good, and so she had everything going that she could have just left and started over back in Moab, but she decides to be faithful to Naomi. The second point is living on the edge. And so they make it back to Bethlehem. And there's no welcome party. There's no one there to greet them as they make it back. No one there to provide for them. And so Ruth tells Naomi, hey, I'm going to go to the fields and glean. And you're like, what does gleaning mean? Okay, I don't know. Like, you can just go to somebody's field and pick stuff up out of their field? That's a thing? Well, it was. It was actually prescribed in the law. We read this a few weeks ago. But here's it working out practically. In the book of Leviticus, chapter 19, the Bible says this: when you reap the harvest of your land, do not reap to the very edges of your field or gather the gleanings of your harvest. Do not go over your vineyard a second time or pick up the grapes that have fallen. Leave them for the poor and the foreigner. And so the Jews were prescribed that when they would harvest their field, to leave a little bit on the outside, to harvest most of it, but leave a little bit on the outside. And if you've ever seen like a modern harvester, they're pretty good these days, but even the good ones these days, when they harvest, there's some stuff that falls out in the process. It falls to the ground. And so the Lord said, hey, as you're harvesting, if some grapes fall off the vine, leave them. And then the other people in the community who were poor, who couldn't afford, it was kind of like a built-in kind of social welfare type system where those who needed the help could come to the field, and around the outside and in the field, whatever fell down, they were allowed to take. And so Ruth goes to the field of a relative, and she's gleaning, meaning she's picking fruit from the outside and picking up the stuff that fell after they harvested. And so Naomi and Ruth are not thriving by any means. They're quite literally doing whatever they can to survive. And then Boaz shows up. And he takes notice of Ruth working out in the field. And he goes up to her and he says, hey, I've noticed what you've been doing to take care of your mother-in-law. I know that you don't have any obligation to Naomi once her husband died and your husband died. You should have been free to go find a new husband. And I see what you've been doing. Instead, you've committed to stay and to protect her and to do whatever you can to care for her. And so then Boaz goes above and beyond. I'm not going to read it to you because we'd be here until 2 o'clock today reading the whole story. But he goes above and beyond what's required of him. What was required was just to let her glean. And he says, no. Like, I'm gonna take care of you. And look how Ruth responds in chapter 2, verse 10. Says, at this, she bowed down with her face to the ground. She asked him, why have I found such favor in your eyes that you notice me, a foreigner? You see, nothing's changed externally. Nothing has changed for her externally. Ruth is still out picking up scraps out of the field. But we can see that behind the scenes, things are starting to shift. You never know when that's happening in your life. You never know when you're being faithful, working in the field, picking up the scraps, going to work every day, punching the time clock, doing the thing that seems insignificant. What's happening behind the scenes, what God is doing. And I just want to remind you this morning that just because you might be in a low place, you might be in a dark place, doesn't mean that God isn't already working on your behalf. Point number 3, Boaz redeems Ruth. See, Boaz is doing pretty well for himself. Boaz is a wealthy man. Boaz is respected. He's established. He's an older man. But he's got a little bit of a story too. You see, Boaz's mother is Rahab. Y'all remember who Rahab is? So Rahab's in the book of Joshua chapter 2. When the spies enter the land, they provide a safe haven for them and help them escape so they don't get caught. And in exchange, they say, hey, hang the little red string outside your window. When we come in and kill everybody, we'll make sure and spare you. And so she's spared. But we find out in that story that Rahab is a Canaanite prostitute. And so apparently, she marries into Jewish culture, and she has a son named Boaz. You see, even the insider in this story is an outsider. And the people that God uses aren't perfect, they're redeemed. That's good news for you and me this morning. You can read the rest of chapter 2 and 3. Hopefully you did yesterday. It was in our Bible reading yesterday if you're reading the Bible with us. By the way, today is day 98, which means if you're reading along with us on Tuesday is day 100 of reading the Bible this year. So if you're reading along with us, we're on approaching day, I think we've now read 9 books of the Bible this year. And we're going to start going pretty quick here through a few of these books. But you can read the story. Hopefully you did. And if you didn't, you can read it today. You can read Ruth chapter 2 and 3. The whole book of Ruth is 4 chapters. You could read it in like 10 minutes. But you can read the story of how they come together, like a blanket and some feet, and it's the whole thing. I have to tell y'all a funny story the other night. Ashley fell asleep on the couch and she was like freezing. If y'all been around, I've talked about this stupid air conditioning event in my living room. Y'all ever seen The Big Bang Theory when Sheldon talks about his seat, how it's like it's the perfect space between the window and the door so it doesn't have a draft and all that? Well, my seat is the opposite of that. My seat is, it's the best seat in the living room, because it's got an end table and the TV's right in front of it, but there's an air conditioning vent right above my head. And that was completely fine until I shaved my head. And now when the air conditioning is blowing out like 40-degree cold air, there's no insulation up here to keep it. And so y'all will see if we ever get on a Zoom call in like July, I'll be wearing a toboggan on my head in my house in the middle of the summertime. But the other night, Ashley fell asleep on the couch next to me, and her blanket was on the floor, and she kind of woke up. She's like, babe, can you grab my blanket? My feet are cold. And I looked up, and I had a microfiber cleaning cloth that was like about this big. And so I grabbed it, and I put it on her feet. And she was like, that's not the blanket. And I was like, you said your feet were cold. I covered your feet up. And she was like, no, the blanket. And so that's kind of what happens. That's like the Buster version of what happens in Ruth. Boaz's feet are cold, and Ruth covers his feet, and now they're getting married. Read it. That's basically what it says. And Ruth proposes to Boaz. She says, hey, you're our family's kinsman redeemer. Some translations call it the guardian redeemer of the family. So it says, you're our family's kinsman redeemer. Can you help us? We're going to talk about that in just a minute, but Boaz responds like, yes, I'll help, but there's a little bit of a problem we have to navigate before I can help. And in chapter 3, verse 11 and 12, Boaz says, and now, my daughter, don't be afraid. I will do for you I will do for you all you ask. All the people of my town know that you are a woman of noble character. Although it is true that I am a guardian redeemer of our family, there is another who is more closely related than I. And so you might be thinking that this idea of a guardian redeemer or a kinsman redeemer, it's kind of foreign to our culture today, not something that we still practice in today's culture. But a kinsman redeemer was prescribed in the law. And what a kinsman redeemer was comes from the book of Leviticus, chapter 25, verse 25. The Bible says, if one of your fellow Israelites becomes poor and sells some of their property, their nearest relative is to come and redeem what they have sold. And then they were to hang on to it, the ownership of it, until the year of Jubilee. And when the year of Jubilee came, which was every 50 years, and so when the year of Jubilee came, they would give it back. And so this system, what it was to honor and protect the legacy of the person. So like if you were a male in Israel, in Jewish culture, your inheritance, your legacy would be protected. Even if you had to sell it, there was somebody in your family who was designated. If you needed to sell off your property in order to, pay your bills, whatever you had to do, someone in your family was obligated to purchase it and hang on to it until the year of Jubilee so that they would protect you from selling off your land to someone who wasn't part of your tribe or part of your family. That make sense? And so the original kinsman redeemer for Naomi says at first that, Boaz goes to the city gates and he says, hey, y'all know Naomi and Ruth, they've hit some hard times. Like they need to sell off their property. And they asked me to buy it, but technically you're the kinsman redeemer. So like you have first dibs on buying this land. And he says, yeah, I'm going to do that. And he says, oh, but don't forget Ruth's husband's dead too. So you're going to have to marry Ruth and give her a child so that, the family line can continue. And then that guy says, well, on second thought, I don't know about all that. He says, if I were to do that, it would tarnish my reputation to marry a foreign woman, especially a Moabite. You know what the Bible says about Moabites. They're cursed. I can't marry a Moabite woman. And second, even if I did that, like if I add another kid to this family, I got to split up my inheritance among more kids. So you go ahead, Boaz, you marry her. You buy the land. You see, you can read this story and you can think like, oh, it's just a cute, cool story, but you could miss the fact that redemption always costs the redeemer something. Boaz risked his reputation. Boaz risked the inheritance. He was going to have to divide his inheritance more than, we don't know how many kids he had, but you had to add one more piece of the pie to the inheritance when you would redeem it and marry and birth the child. This is kind of a picture of what Jesus did. Jesus is the ultimate redeemer. He redeemed you and me, but it cost him something. And so Boaz marries Ruth, and they have a son named Obed. And so we see in this story arc, that Boaz redeems Ruth. He restores Naomi. Naomi, just kind of like this weird thing in their culture where Boaz and Ruth have Obed, but she kind of becomes Naomi's child of sorts. And in this process, Boaz helps restore what had looked like a broken future, a broken family line that was going to die out and be no more. You see, God doesn't just fix what's broken, He restores what's lost. And so you might be thinking like, cool story, bro. What does that have to do with us today? Well, it has a lot to do with us today. I want to very quickly give you 4 things that this means for us today. The first one is this: God uses the people the world overlooks. Ruth was an outsider. Rahab was an outsider. These people shouldn't even have a place in the story. But sometimes the people that the world writes off, God writes in. The second thing is this: outsider is not your identity. Some people in this room listening to us online, you might be thinking, you might feel like you've been disqualified. You might feel unseen. You might feel like you don't belong. But in the kingdom of God, outsider is not your identity. It's your starting point. One of my pastors says that God doesn't call the qualified, He qualifies the called. Whatever you think you bring to the table, He doesn't need it. He'll give you what you need. A third thing is this: don't confuse comfort with completion. See, this was something, when I read this story this time, something that I noticed. When you read, this is a story about Ruth. She finds her Boaz. And it's easy to miss this story from Boaz's perspective. You see, for a lot of people, when they read this story, they see themselves as Ruth. And I was talking with some youngsters, having them translate for me, because I don't speak whatever language they speak these days. But we can get main character syndrome when we read the Bible. Did I do that right? Yeah, okay. Good, thanks. But we can read these stories and we always see ourselves as the main character in the story. Like we have to identify with Ruth. And in this story, Ruth is lost, broken, her hope's been diminished, she has no future. She's just committed to helping her mother-in-law. And there's nothing wrong. If that's you, when you read the story, you identify with Ruth, there's nothing wrong with that. But some of you aren't Ruth in this story. Some of you are Boaz. Boaz was stable. He was established. He was comfortable. He wasn't worried about paying the light bill. And if you're not careful, you can read this story and you say, well, I'm not Ruth, so this story doesn't mean anything to me. Boaz didn't need anything. He was content. He had the 401k pension fully funded, whatever. He was ready to retire. He could have just stayed doing what he was doing, minding his own business. Let somebody else. In fact, he had an out. He could have made the other guy do it. When the other guy said, like, I don't know, he'd be like, well, that's your duty. You need to go marry her. You have to. Or we'll go talk to the priest and you can explain to the priest why you don't want to fulfill your duty. Right? Boaz didn't have to do anything. They weren't his problem. Listen, just because you're comfortable doesn't mean you're not finished. It's easy to lean on God when you need something. Times in my life when I felt closest to the Lord are the times in my life that have been the toughest. Why? Because you don't have anything else. You have to lean on the Lord in those times. But remember, a few weeks ago, I taught a message called Do Not Forget the Lord. It says, when you enter into the promised land, when you possess the promise, when things are going well, be careful not to forget the Lord. Be careful when things are going well that you don't think you've got it all figured out. Because listen, there are plenty of people. There are people in this room, people that are listening to us online. There's plenty of people who need God to get them out of something. And if that's you, God is faithful and He can do it. But there's other people who are listening to this message, who read this story, who need to ask God, what do you want to do through me? How do you want to use me? The fourth thing I want you to catch from this story is this: God is building something bigger than you can see. I've shared the story a few times about when I was younger, probably 12 or 13 years ago. I was having coffee with a friend, and I kind of told him I had this like grandiose plan of what I was going to do for the Lord, and he paused me. He's since passed on and everything, but he paused me in that moment, and he said, Buster, he goes, I know you. He goes, you think you got it all figured out. He said, but the Lord wants you to know that what you're seeing is part of a puzzle, and the vision you have is like 100 pieces of the puzzle. But it's like a 5,000 piece puzzle and you don't even know it yet. The picture isn't what you think it is, just because of the small piece that you can see. See, because God is building something bigger than what you can see. Ruth and Boaz had a son named Obed. And Obed had a son named Jesse. And Jesse had 8 sons. And the youngest was a boy named David, King David. We know that because the Bible tells us in Matthew chapter 1, I don't know if it's Salmon or Salmon. Is the L silent in Hebrew like it is in English? So, Salmon, the father of Boaz, whose mother was Rahab. Boaz, this is the genealogy in the book of Matthew. So Salmon, the father of Boaz, whose mother was Rahab. Boaz, the father of Obed, whose mother was Ruth. Obed, the father of Jesse. And Jesse, the father of King David. Listen, what seems insignificant, the son of a Canaanite prostitute redeeming a couple of pagan widows. Might just be part of a bigger story. Ruth just thought she was trying to survive. What she didn't know is that God was building a lineage. Boaz redeemed his family, but through Boaz and Ruth, God redeemed all of his creation. So what do we do with all this? Well, if you feel like Ruth, if you feel like you've been overlooked, you feel like you don't belong, you feel like there's no hope, I want you to know this morning that God sees you and He's already working. Ask Him where to go, what to do. Remember, we talked a few weeks ago or last week, I think, faithfulness positions us to receive from God. And if you're in a place like Boaz where life is stable, you're not in crisis, you're not worried about things, ask God, where are you asking me to step in? If you feel like you're on the outside, you can trust that God is working. The Bible tells us in Romans 8:28 that we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love Him, who are called according to His purpose. But if you're already on the inside, don't get comfortable. God might be asking you to step out. And in either case, whether you're Ruth this morning or Boaz, look to Jesus. Boaz is a picture of Jesus, who's the true Redeemer. And whether you're Ruth, who's waiting for a breakthrough, or you're Boaz, holding the keys to someone else's, remember this: the people God uses are those who are willing to be used. And so I want to encourage us this morning, let's be a people who are willing to be used by God. Amen?